Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
You know what's worse than having a controlling mother-in-law? One who dumps boiling oil on your face in the middle of lunch because you refuse to give away your home. And my husband? He just laughed. But when she saw two police cars outside her door, she realized I wasn't someone to mess with. It started as an ordinary Sunday lunch. My husband and I had settled into this routine of hosting his mother once or twice a month, despite how exhausting it was. She wasn't exactly the warm and fuzzy type. In fact, most of her visits ended with her storming out in some dramatic fit. Still, I always tried to keep the peace. That day, I'd gone all out with the meal. Her favorite dishes, the nice tableware, even a fresh floral centerpiece. But as soon as she walked in, she wrinkled her nose. "Oh, you're still decorating with these tacky colors," she said, motioning to the curtains I'd recently put up. My husband chuckled awkwardly, as he always did when she criticized me, but I let it slide. I'd learned that biting my tongue was the easiest way to get through these lunches. For a while, the conversation was mundane. She bragged about her bridge club, complained about the neighbors, and nitpicked my cooking. Everything was going as expected until she dropped the bombshell. "So, my friend Gloria is moving to the city next month," she said, dabbing her mouth with a napkin. "And I told her she could have your house." I froze, thinking I must have misheard her. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," she said, leaning back in her chair with a satisfied smirk. "Gloria's a dear friend, and she's going through a hard time. She needs a place to stay, and your house is perfect. It's not like you can't find another place." I let out a nervous laugh, assuming she was joking. "That's not going to happen." Her face darkened instantly. She slammed her glass down so hard I thought it might crack. "You witch," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "Give me this house, or your marriage is over. Do you hear me?" My jaw dropped. "You can't be serious," I said, looking at my husband for backup. He just shrugged, stuffing another bite of food into his mouth. "You know how she gets," he mumbled, as if that excused her behavior. I turned back to her, trying to stay calm. "This is our home. We're not just going to hand it over because you decided someone else deserves it more." That's when she exploded. She shot up from her seat, knocking over her chair, and started ranting about how ungrateful I was, how I didn't deserve her son, and how I was ruining their family. I stayed seated, refusing to engage, but my hands were shaking under the table. Then it happened. She stormed over to the stove, where I'd left a pot of oil simmering to fry some appetizers. Before I could process what she was doing, she grabbed the handle and hurled the pot in my direction. I barely had time to move. The oil splashed across my cheek and hand, and the pain was immediate and searing. I screamed, clutching my face as tears blurred my vision. And my husband? He didn't even flinch. He just sat there, chuckling nervously like this was some absurd sitcom. "Come on, Mom," he said lazily. "You didn't have to go that far." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The room spun as I stumbled toward the sink, running cold water over my burns. My mother-in-law was still yelling in the background, calling me weak and dramatic, but her voice sounded distant, like I was underwater. When I finally turned back around, she was standing there, smug and unapologetic. "This is what happens when you don't respect me," she said, crossing her arms. My husband was still at the table, scrolling on his phone like nothing had happened. I stared at them both, my face throbbing with pain, and realized something I should have seen long ago. I was on my own, but I wasn't going to let this slide. Not this time. I stood at the sink, my hands trembling as cold water streamed over the angry red burns on my skin. The pain was unbearable, sharp and relentless, but what hurt more was the scene behind me. My husband, the man I thought I could count on, was still sitting at the table, eating like nothing had happened. "Are you seriously not going to say anything?" I choked out, my voice breaking under the weight of my emotions. I turned to look at him, my wet hair sticking to my face, tears mixing with water dripping from my hands. My cheek felt like it was on fire, and my hand throbbed with a dull ache, but his indifference hit harder than any physical pain. He didn't even look up at me. Instead, he casually speared a piece of chicken with his fork, chewing slowly. "What do you want me to say?" he asked, his tone flat, almost annoyed. "You should have just said yes. You know how she gets." I couldn't believe the words coming out of his mouth. "Are you hearing yourself right now?" I asked, my voice rising. "She threw hot oil at me, and you're sitting there like it's no big deal." He finally glanced up, his expression completely devoid of sympathy. "Look, you know how my mom is. She gets angry, she overreacts, but she's still family. You're the one who escalated this by refusing her. Escalated? I repeated, my voice shaking. I said no to giving away our home. That's not escalating. That's setting a boundary. Behind him, my mother-in-law was still pacing the dining room, muttering under her breath. Occasionally, she'd stop to glare at me, her lips curling into a satisfied smirk. Ungrateful little brat, she spat. After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me? I laughed bitterly, the sound hollow and humorless. Everything you've done for me? What does that even mean? You've done nothing but criticize me since the day I met you. That only fueled her anger. She turned her attention to my husband, her voice dripping with manipulation. You see what I mean, darling? She's impossible. I told you she wasn't good enough for you. And then he said it, the sentence that changed everything. Mom's right. You're making this harder than it needs to be. I froze, my heart sinking into my stomach. Those words hit like a punch to the gut, knocking the air out of me. He wasn't just defending her behavior. He was siding with her, justifying her assault on me as if I was the one in the wrong. I turned back to the sink, gripping the edge so hard my knuckles turned white. I didn't want to cry in front of them, to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. But the tears came anyway, hot and angry, blurring my vision as I tried to think. In the background, the insults kept coming. My mother-in-law called me selfish, ungrateful, a gold digger. She said I was poisoning her son against her, that I was trying to isolate him from his family. Each word felt like a dagger, aimed directly at my heart, but what hurt the most was that my husband didn't stop her. Instead, he finally stood up, brushing crumbs off his shirt, and said, "Let's just all calm down. This is getting out of hand." I couldn't hold back anymore. I whirled around to face him, my voice trembling with rage. Getting out of hand? You think this is about me overreacting? She physically attacked me, and you're acting like it's just another family argument. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck like he was the one being inconvenienced. You're blowing this out of proportion. It's not like she meant to hurt you. At that, his mother laughed, a sharp, cruel sound that sent a shiver down my spine. Of course I meant to hurt her, she said, her tone laced with venom. Maybe next time she'll learn to respect me. I stared at them both, my stomach churning with a mixture of rage and disbelief. How had I ended up here, married to a man who thought this was acceptable? I'd always known his relationship with his mother was complicated, but I never realized just how much control she had over him, or how little he cared about me. Unbelievable, I muttered, shaking my head. You're both unbelievable. My husband rolled his eyes. Can we just eat in peace? You're ruining lunch. That was it, the final straw. I felt something inside me snap, a resolve hardening in the pit of my stomach. I wasn't going to let this go. I wasn't going to let them gaslight me into thinking I was overreacting or that this was normal. I wiped my face, wincing as my burnt cheek brushed against the towel, and walked past them toward the stairs. My husband called after me, his tone half-hearted. Where are you going? To clean myself up, I said without turning around. And then I'm calling the police. The room fell silent. For the first time, my mother-in-law looked genuinely stunned. You wouldn't dare, she said, her voice trembling with disbelief. I didn't answer. I didn't need to, because in that moment I knew exactly what I needed to do. I locked myself in the bathroom, leaning heavily against the door as my legs wobbled beneath me. My reflection in the mirror stopped me cold. The angry red burn on my cheek was glaring and swollen, a cruel reminder of what had just happened. My hand, though less visible, throbbed with pain. I could still hear their voices downstairs, my mother-in-law grumbling, and my husband muttering as though I were the one at fault. I turned on the cold water, letting it run over my hand as I tried to calm my racing heart. But the more I thought about it, the angrier I became. How had it come to this? How had I allowed myself to end up in a marriage where I was treated like a nuisance, not a partner? The sheer betrayal of my husband sitting there, condoning her actions, cut deeper than the burns ever could. But no, I wasn't going to cry, not over this, not in a house where they could hear me. I pushed the emotions down, burying the sobs that threatened to break free, and focused on cleaning up the mess she had made of me. I dabbed the burn on my cheek with a cool cloth, wincing as the pain flared, and applied some ointment I found in the cabinet. My hands trembled, not just from the pain, but from the resolve that was slowly building within me. When I finally came out of the bathroom, I felt raw but steady. The first thing I saw was her. My mother-in-law was still at the table, sipping her drink like a queen surveying her kingdom. She looked up at me with that smug smirk she always wore, as if daring me to challenge her. What? No more theatrics, she said, chuckling under her breath. I thought you'd at least put on a show for us. I didn't answer. I didn't even look at her. Instead, I walked past them both, heading straight for my phone, which I'd left on the kitchen counter. Hey, my husband called after me, his tone filled with mild confusion. What are you doing? I ignored him, my fingers moving swiftly to unlock my phone. I opened the camera and snapped a series of pictures, close-ups of my cheek and hand, wide shots that included the kitchen, and even one of the stove with a now empty pot of oil. I wanted to capture everything, every little detail that would prove what had happened here. What are you taking pictures for? My husband asked again, this time with a hint of annoyance. I finally turned to face him, my voice calm but firm. For evidence. He blinked, clearly caught off guard. Evidence? Evidence of what? You're being ridiculous. I didn't reply. I was done explaining myself to him. Done trying to get him to understand things he was determined to ignore. My mother-in-law let out a laugh, loud and condescending. Evidence? Oh, please. Who do you think is going to believe you? You're just a hysterical little girl. You probably burned yourself to get attention. Her words stung, but I didn't let them show. I'd heard enough from her over the years to know that reacting only gave her power. So I slipped my phone into my pocket and walked past them again, heading upstairs to the guest room. That night, I shut myself in the guest room, locking the door behind me. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the photos I'd taken. The burns looked even worse under the harsh lighting of the camera flash. For a moment, I hesitated. Was I really going to go through with this? Calling the police on my own family, or what was supposed to be my family, felt like crossing a line that couldn't be undone. But then I thought about her face as she threw the oil, the complete lack of remorse in her eyes, and my husband's indifferent shrug as he dismissed my pain. No, I wasn't the one crossing the line. They had crossed it long ago. A knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. It was him. Can we talk? My husband's voice called through the door, muffled but still carrying that same infuriating tone of casualness. I didn't answer. I know you're upset, he continued, but she's my mom. You've got to understand that I can't just turn my back on her. She doesn't mean half the things she says. I stayed silent, my anger simmering beneath the surface. His words only confirmed what I already knew. He wasn't on my side. Come on, babe, he said, his voice softening. Let's just move past this, okay? It's not worth all this drama. Drama. That's what he thought this was. Not an assault. Not a betrayal. Just drama. I'm going to bed, I finally said, my voice cold and detached. There was a long pause before I heard him sigh and walk away. As his footsteps faded, I felt a strange sense of clarity. This wasn't a partnership. This wasn't love. This was me, standing alone against the people who were supposed to protect me. I didn't sleep much that night. My mind was racing, replaying every moment of the day and plotting what I would do next. By the time morning came, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let this go. I wasn't going to let them win. This time, I would fight back. Morning arrived after a restless night. My body was heavy with exhaustion, but my mind was sharper than it had been in months. As I stared at the red burn on my cheek in the bathroom mirror, I knew what I had to do. The events of the previous day were etched into my skin, and every time I touched the swollen, blistered area on my hand, a fresh wave of determination surged through me. By the time I stepped out of the guest room, the house was quiet. My husband had gone to work early, and for that, I was grateful. I didn't want to face him. Not before I'd done what needed to be done. My mother-in-law was gone too, presumably back at her place to gloat about her victory. Good. Let her bask in her delusions for now. I grabbed my bag, my phone with the photos, and a sweater to hide the burns, and I headed straight to the police station. The police station was buzzing with activity, but I didn't let myself get overwhelmed. I walked up to the front desk, clutching my phone like a lifeline. A female officer greeted me with a professional but kind smile. Hi, I'd like to report an assault, I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil bubbling beneath the surface. Her eyebrows lifted slightly, and she gestured for me to take a seat while she grabbed a clipboard. Take your time, she said, sliding the paperwork toward me. I filled out the basics, my hands trembling slightly as I wrote down my name, address, and the details of the incident. When the officer returned, she sat across from me, her demeanor serious. Can you tell me exactly what happened? I took a deep breath, recounting every detail of the previous day. The way my mother-in-law had demanded my home, her escalating threats, and the moment she grabbed the pot of hot oil and hurled it at me. I explained how my husband had laughed it off, how he had essentially sided with her, leaving me to fend for myself. Her expression hardened as I spoke, her pen moving rapidly across the page. When I finished, she asked, "Do you have any injuries from the assault?" Wordlessly, I pulled up my sleeve to reveal the burn on my hand, then tilted my face to show her my cheek. Her reaction was immediate. "Good God," she muttered, leaning closer to inspect the burns. "You said this happened yesterday?" "Yes. I've taken photos as well," I replied, unlocking my phone and scrolling to the pictures I'd taken the night before. I handed it to her, and she swiped through the images, her expression darkening with every one. "You're lucky this didn't cause permanent damage," she said, shaking her head. "Do you feel safe in your home?" The question caught me off guard, but I answered honestly. "Not really. Not with her still around, and especially not with my husband defending her." Her eyes softened, and she gave me a reassuring nod. "We'll file this report and get the process started. Based on what you've shown us, this is a serious case of assault. You've done the right thing by coming forward." Hearing those words was a relief I hadn't realized I needed. For the first time in 24 hours, I felt like someone was on my side. When I got back home, my husband's car was in the driveway. He must have come home for lunch. I sighed, bracing myself for the confrontation I knew was coming. As I walked through the front door, he appeared in the hallway, his brow furrowed. "Where were you?" he asked, his tone sharper than usual. I didn't bother sugarcoating it. "I went to the police station," I said, meeting his gaze. "I filed a report against your mother." His reaction was immediate and explosive. His face turned red, and he threw his hands up in disbelief. "You did what? Are you crazy?" "She threw hot oil at me," I said calmly, refusing to match his energy. "I have burns on my face and hand, and she did it on purpose." "What part of that isn't assault to you?" "She's family," he shouted, his voice echoing through the house. "You don't call the cops on family." "Family doesn't do what she did," I shot back, my voice ice cold. He froze for a moment, staring at me like I'd just spoken a foreign language. Then his expression twisted into something almost unrecognizable. "You're really going to destroy this family over one stupid argument?" "One stupid argument?" I repeated, laughing bitterly. "She tried to hurt me, and you're acting like I'm overreacting. Do you even hear yourself?" He opened his mouth to respond, but I cut him off. "No, you know what? I don't care what you think anymore. I'm done trying to reason with you. The police are involved now, and she's going to face the consequences of her actions." That night, we didn't speak. I stayed in the guest room again, locking the door behind me. My phone buzzed with messages from him, alternating between pleas to fix this and veiled threats about how I was tearing the family apart. I ignored them all. In the silence of the room, I scrolled through the photos on my phone again, feeling the weight of what I'd done. But there was no regret, only a deep, unwavering resolve. This was only the beginning, and I was ready to see it through to the end. That evening, the air in the house was thick with tension. My husband had stopped pacing and was now sulking on the couch, scrolling on his phone in silence. He hadn't spoken to me since our argument earlier, but the energy he radiated was toxic, full of anger and disbelief. I was in the kitchen, cleaning up the dishes I'd neglected in my emotional haze earlier. The act of scrubbing plates and rinsing glasses felt grounding, a small way to reassert some control over my life. I was so focused on the rhythmic motion of my hands that I almost didn't hear the knock at the door. At first, it was a faint sound, as though whoever was knocking wasn't sure they were welcome. Then, it grew louder, more insistent. "Can you get that?" My husband called out from the living room, his voice clipped. "No," I replied simply, drying my hands on a towel. With a frustrated sigh, he stood up and headed for the door. Before he could reach it, my mother-in-law appeared at the top of the stairs, her voice sharp and impatient. "I'll handle it," she snapped, descending quickly as if she were the ruler of the house. When she opened the door, the smug expression she'd been wearing all day vanished in an instant. Standing there were two uniformed police officers, their faces professional but stern. "Ma'am," one of them said, his voice calm but firm, "we're here regarding a report of assault." "Are you Mrs. Mother-in-law's last name?" Her face contorted into a mixture of shock and outrage. "What? Assault? What nonsense is this?" The officer ignored her protests and continued. "We have reason to believe you were involved in an incident that resulted in physical harm to another person. We'd like you to come with us for questioning." "What is this about?" she demanded, her voice shrill. Her eyes darted toward me as I entered the living room, drawn by the commotion. "You," she screeched, pointing a finger at me. "You called the cops on me?" I stood my ground, keeping my voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "You assaulted me. Actions have consequences." Her face flushed with anger, and for a moment, I thought she might lunge at me right then and there. The officers stepped forward slightly, their presence a silent reminder that she wasn't in control here. "This is ridiculous," she shouted, turning back to the officers. "She's lying. She probably burned herself and blamed me to get attention. You don't seriously believe her, do you?" One of the officers spoke up, his tone neutral but unyielding. "Ma'am, we're here to investigate the claims. You're not under arrest at this time, but we need you to come down to the station for questioning." At that, she spun around to my husband, who had been standing silently by the couch. "Are you seriously going to let this happen?" she demanded. "Say something." He looked between me and the officers, his face pale and his jaw clenched. Finally, he stepped forward, his hands raised in what I guessed was supposed to be a placating gesture. "Look," he began, his tone weary. "This is all just a big misunderstanding. My mom didn't mean any harm. Things got heated, and—" The officer cut him off. "We're not here to mediate family disputes. We're here because we have evidence of an assault. Your wife provided photos of her injuries, and we'll need your mother to answer some questions." My husband turned to me, his eyes narrowing. "You really couldn't just let this go, huh?" I stared at him, my voice low and steady. "She threw hot oil at me. If you can't see why that's a problem, then you're as much of an issue as she is." For a moment, he looked like he might argue, but then he stepped back, muttering under his breath. The officer stepped aside to let my mother-in-law grab her things. She made a show of dragging her feet, throwing dramatic glances my way, as if trying to guilt me into stopping this. "You're going to regret this," she hissed as she put on her coat. "You think you've won, but you have no idea who you're dealing with." I didn't flinch. "The only thing I regret is letting you treat me like a doormat for so long." Her threats continued as the officers escorted her out of the house. She shouted about how I was ruining the family, how my marriage was doomed, how I'd pay for this. Her voice faded as the door closed behind them, and I felt an eerie silence settle over the house. My husband and I stood in the living room, staring at each other. His face was a mix of disbelief and anger, and I could feel the resentment rolling off him in waves. "You've really done it now," he said finally, his voice low. I crossed my arms, feeling the weight of my decision, but not regretting it. If standing up for myself is doing it, then yes, I've done it. "This is going to tear the family apart," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "No," I said firmly. "Your mother's actions are tearing the family apart. I'm just holding her accountable." He didn't respond. Instead, he grabbed his keys and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was alone, truly alone. And yet, as I sat down on the couch and stared at the quiet space around me, I didn't feel sad. I felt relief. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. But at least for now, I had taken the first step in reclaiming my life. The news spread like wildfire, carried by the whispers of relatives who always seemed to thrive on drama. By the next morning, I was already getting phone calls and texts from family members, some outraged, others cautiously supportive. The first message came from my husband's sister, Sarah. "What the hell is going on? Mom called me from the station. She said you're ruining the family. Call me ASAP." It didn't surprise me. Sarah had always been their mother's biggest cheerleader, defending her even when she was undeniably in the wrong. I didn't reply to Sarah, but other messages started trickling in. My cousin-in-law Julia sent me a cautious text, heard about the incident. "I'm so sorry. If you ever need to talk, I'm here." Julia had always been wary of my mother-in-law, having been on the receiving end of her sharp tongue a few times at family gatherings. The phone calls, however, were the worst. The first one came from my husband's aunt, Patricia. I didn't even have a chance to say hello before she launched into a tirade. "How could you call the police on your own family?" she demanded, her voice trembling with indignation. "Do you have any idea what this is doing to us? To your husband? You're blowing this way out of proportion." I held the phone away from my ear, taking a deep breath before responding. "She threw boiling oil at me, Patricia. I have burns on my face and hand. This isn't about family loyalty. It's about basic human decency." Patricia scoffed. "Oh, please. She didn't mean it. You're exaggerating, making her out to be some kind of monster. Families fight. You don't involve the police over a little disagreement." "A little disagreement?" I repeated, my voice rising despite my best efforts to stay calm. "Would you say the same thing if someone threw oil at you? Or are we supposed to let her get away with everything just because she's family?" She hung up on me. By midday, the narrative had fully split down the middle. On one side were the defenders, mostly older relatives who believed family mattered above all else, no matter how toxic or abusive the behavior. They accused me of tearing the family apart, of humiliating my husband, of being too sensitive. On the other side were the quieter voices, the ones who reached out in private to say they understood. "You're brave for standing up to her," one cousin wrote. "She's been a bully for years, but no one ever says anything because they're afraid of her." Another text read, "You're not wrong. I've seen how she treats you at family events. I always wondered how you put up with it." These messages helped, but they didn't erase the overwhelming negativity coming from the other camp. When my husband came home that evening, the tension was suffocating. He walked in without a word, slamming the door behind him before tossing his keys onto the table. I was sitting on the couch, staring at my phone, trying to muster the energy to face another argument. "Do you even realize what you've done?" he snapped, breaking the silence. I turned to look at him, feeling a flicker of irritation at his dramatic entrance. "Yes, I do," I said evenly. I stood up for myself. He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "You've humiliated my mother. You've embarrassed me. Everyone's talking about it. Do you know how hard I've been working to put out the fires you started?" "Fires I started?" I shot back, standing up to face him. "Your mother assaulted me. I didn't do this, she did. And instead of supporting me, you've been defending her." He groaned, running his hands through his hair in frustration. "How could you do this to my mother? How could she do this to me?" I countered, my voice rising. We stared at each other, a chasm widening between us with every passing second. I could see the anger in his eyes, but underneath it, there was something else, something that almost looked like fear. "You're blowing this out of proportion," he said finally, his tone quieter but no less accusatory. "Of course you'd think that," I said bitterly. "You've been letting her get away with this behavior for years. You're so used to her toxicity that you can't even see how messed up it is." That was the first of many arguments. Over the next few days, the tension in the house grew unbearable. He couldn't understand why I wouldn't let it go, and I couldn't understand how he could defend her actions. One night, during yet another fight, he finally said what I knew he'd been thinking all along. "You're destroying this family. Is that what you want?" I laughed, but it was a hollow, humorless sound. "Your mother is destroying this family. I'm just not letting her do it to me anymore." The argument ended with him storming out of the house, slamming the door behind him. I sat there in the silence, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and relief. In the days that followed, I started to notice something interesting. While my husband and the more vocal relatives continued to berate me, there was a subtle shift in the way some family members interacted with me. People who had never spoken out against my mother-in-law before were suddenly reaching out to share their own stories of her manipulation and cruelty. "She's done similar things to me," one cousin admitted during a phone call. "Not with oil, but the way she tries to control everyone, it's suffocating. I wish I had the courage to stand up to her like you did." Another relative confided, "I always thought you were so patient for putting up with her. I don't know if I could have lasted as long as you did." These conversations reminded me that I wasn't alone. For years, I'd been made to feel like I was the problem, like I wasn't good enough for this family. But now, I realized that the problem wasn't me. It was her. And no matter how loud her defenders were, I wasn't going to back down. The days following my mother-in-law's removal from the house felt surreal. While I tried to focus on healing, both physically and emotionally, the fallout from the incident continued to ripple through my life. It was exhausting, but I knew this wasn't over. What I didn't realize was just how deep the rabbit hole would go. The first shot came during a phone call from the police. They had begun their investigation into the assault, and while reviewing my case, something had come up. "We've uncovered some other complaints involving your mother-in-law," the officer said. "Complaints?" I asked, gripping the phone tightly. "Yes," the officer continued. "It seems this isn't the first time she's been accused of inappropriate or potentially criminal behavior. Have you ever heard anything about her being involved in harassment or fraud?" I paused, my mind racing. My mother-in-law's bullying was no secret to me, but fraud? That was new. "No," I said finally. "I mean, she's always been controlling and manipulative, but I didn't know about anything illegal." The officer sighed. "We're still gathering information, but I wanted to give you a heads up. If you receive any threats or unusual behavior from her or anyone connected to her, please let us know immediately. We've seen patterns like this escalate in similar cases." The call left me shaken. Fraud? Harassment? What else was this woman hiding? Digging, combing through public records, and even reaching out to some of the family members who had quietly supported me after the incident. Slowly, a picture began to form. A picture of a woman who had spent decades manipulating and intimidating those around her, often walking a fine line between morally questionable behavior and outright criminality. One cousin told me about how my mother-in-law had once coerced her into signing over a piece of property, threatening to ostracize her from the family if she didn't comply. Another relative admitted that she'd borrowed money from him under the guise of a family emergency and never paid it back. "She's a master manipulator," Julia, my cousin-in-law, said during one of our conversations. "And she always gets away with it because no one wants to stand up to her. Everyone's too scared of the backlash." Meanwhile, things at home were deteriorating rapidly. My husband had taken up residence on the moral high ground, constantly lecturing me about how I was overreacting. "You're digging up dirt on my mom now?" he snapped one evening when he caught me researching her financial history. "What is wrong with you? Are you trying to destroy her?" "I'm trying to protect myself," I shot back, refusing to let him guilt me. "The police think she might retaliate. Do you even care about that?" "She's not going to retaliate," he said dismissively. "You're just paranoid." "Am I?" I asked, my voice rising. "Because the way I see it, you're more concerned about your mother's reputation than my safety." She threw hot oil at me. "And you still think she's the victim? You just don't understand," he muttered, shaking his head as he walked away. That night, I sat down and started documenting everything. Every threat she'd ever made, every instance of her controlling behavior, every argument where my husband had defended her instead of me. It all went into a file. I included screenshots of text messages, photos of the burns, and notes from my conversations with family members. It felt tedious, even overwhelming at times, but it also felt necessary. If she was capable of throwing boiling oil at me in a fit of rage, what else could she do? I wasn't going to leave anything to chance. A week later, I received another call from the police. This time, the officer's tone was even more serious. "We found some troubling financial activity linked to your mother-in-law," he said. "Without going into too much detail, there are allegations of fraud and embezzlement that we're currently investigating. Has she ever asked you for money or tried to involve you in any financial dealings?" "No," I said, stunned. "She's always treated me like I was beneath her. She wouldn't trust me with anything important." The officer hummed thoughtfully. "It's not uncommon for people like her to keep their dealings compartmentalized. Just be careful. Cases like this can escalate quickly, especially when the person feels cornered." That warning stayed with me. The next day, I noticed something strange, an unfamiliar car parked near the house. It wasn't unusual for neighbors to have visitors, but the car stayed there for hours, and I could feel someone watching me through the curtains. My skin prickled with unease, and I immediately called the police to report it. It was moments like that when the reality of my situation truly hit me. I wasn't just dealing with an overbearing mother-in-law or a failing marriage anymore. This was a battle against someone who was capable of anything to protect her carefully crafted image. Despite the mounting tension, my husband continued to insist that I was overreacting. One night, as I was going through my notes, he stormed into the room, slamming the door behind him. "I'm done with this," he said angrily. "You're turning this into a witch hunt. Do you even care about what this is doing to me?" I looked up at him, my exhaustion giving way to fury. "What it's doing to you? She almost disfigured me. And you're worried about your reputation? Do you even hear yourself? She's my mother," he shouted, his face red with frustration. "And I'm your wife." I shouted back, But does that mean nothing to you anymore?" For a moment, the room was silent except for the sound of our heavy breathing. Then he said quietly, but with a venom I'd never heard before, "You're tearing this family apart." "No," I said, my voice steady despite the tears welling in my eyes. "She tore it apart. I'm just finally standing up for myself." That night, as I sat alone in the guest room, I felt a mix of emotions: fear, anger, sadness, but above all, determination. I wasn't going to let her intimidate me, and I wasn't going to let him convince me that this was my fault. This wasn't just about the oil anymore. It was about standing up to years of manipulation, lies, and abuse. And no matter how messy things got, I was ready to fight for what I deserved. Another argument. Another shouting match that left me feeling drained and wondering why I had held on this long. This one had started over something trivial. Laundry of all things, but, as always, it quickly spiraled into the same tired refrain. His mother. "You've got to drop this vendetta against her," he yelled, pacing back and forth across the living room like an agitated animal. "Vendetta?" I repeated, incredulous. "She assaulted me. She's under investigation for fraud. How is this a vendetta? She's old, okay? She's not perfect, but she's still my mom. You need to stop dragging her name through the mud," he snapped, pointing a finger at me, as if I were the villain in all this. "And what about me?" I shot back, standing my ground. "Do I not matter? Am I supposed to just take everything she throws at me because she's your mom?" "You don't get it," he barked, his face red with frustration. "She's been through so much. You're only making it worse." I shook my head, my heart breaking a little more with every word. "No," I said quietly but firmly. "You don't get it. You've chosen her over me every single time. And I can't do this anymore." That night, I sat in the guest room, staring at the ceiling as his words replayed in my mind. He was never going to change. I had held on for so long, convincing myself that things would get better, that he would finally see the damage his mother was causing and stand up for me. But that was never going to happen. I wasn't just married to him. I was married to his mother too. And in their eyes, I would always come second. The next morning, I made the decision I'd been avoiding for weeks. I picked up the phone and called a divorce lawyer. Sitting across from the lawyer, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and relief. She was kind but professional, asking all the necessary questions and walking me through the process step by step. "Have you decided on grounds for the divorce?" she asked, pen poised over a notepad. "Yes," I said without hesitation. "Irreconcilable differences." The phrase felt almost laughable, given how deep the differences ran. But it was the cleanest, simplest way to sever the ties that had been choking the life out of me. She nodded and began drafting the paperwork. As I watched her work, a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying began to lift. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt like I was taking control of my own life. The moment I handed him the divorce papers will forever be etched into my memory. He was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone, when I placed the envelope in front of him. "What's this?" he asked, furrowing his brow as he picked it up. "Read it," I said simply. His eyes scanned the first page, and his expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. "You're really doing this?" he asked, looking up at me. "Yes," I replied, my voice calm but resolute. He stood up, the paper still in his hand. "This is insane. You're throwing everything away over one stupid fight." "This isn't about one fight," I said, meeting his gaze. "It's about everything. Your mother's abuse, your refusal to stand up for me, your constant excuses. I've been fighting for this marriage by myself, and I can't do it anymore." "You're overreacting," he said, shaking his head. "You'll regret this." "No," I said, my voice steady. "The only thing I regret is not doing this sooner." As the days passed, I focused on preparing for the next big hurdle, my mother-in-law's trial. The evidence against her was damning. The photos of my burns, the witness statements from family members who had seen her behavior firsthand, and even some of the financial documents the police had uncovered. I knew she would fight tooth and nail to maintain her innocence. She'd already started spreading rumors within the family, painting herself as the victim and me as the conniving daughter-in-law out to destroy her life. But I didn't care. This wasn't just about holding her accountable for what she'd done to me. It was about setting a precedent, about showing her and everyone else that she couldn't bully her way through life anymore. One evening, as I was organizing my documents for the trial, my phone buzzed with a message from Sarah, my husband's sister. "Mom's furious about the trial. She said she's going to destroy you in court. Be careful," the text read. I stared at the screen, a sense of unease settling over me. But instead of fear, I felt something else: determination. Let her try, I thought to myself. I wasn't afraid of her anymore. When I handed my lawyer the last of the documents, she smiled approvingly. "You've been thorough," she said. "That's going to make a big difference in court." "Good," I said. "I want her to see that I'm serious." "And your husband?" she asked gently. I hesitated for a moment before replying. "He's made his choice. And now I've made mine." As I left the lawyer's office that day, I felt a strange sense of peace. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of what was coming. I was ready to face it head on. The morning of the trial felt surreal. I woke up early, my stomach twisted in knots as the weight of the day ahead bore down on me. I spent hours going over the evidence with my lawyer, rehearsing my statements and preparing for the questions I might face on the stand. Despite my nerves, I felt ready. I had the truth on my side, and for once, I wasn't going to let her intimidate me. The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined, but the atmosphere was heavy with tension. My mother-in-law arrived with her attorney, her head held high and an arrogant smirk plastered across her face. She was dressed to impress, as though she thought she could charm her way out of the mess she'd created. When our eyes met, she didn't flinch. Instead, she gave me a mocking smile, her confidence practically radiating off her. It was clear she didn't think anything would come of this. She probably assumed the court would see her as a sweet, misunderstood older woman and me as an overdramatic troublemaker. But I wasn't the same person she'd pushed around all these years. Not anymore. The prosecution began by presenting the photos of my burns. Each image was displayed on a large screen, the redness and blistering impossible to ignore. I heard murmurs ripple through the small crowd of family members and spectators in the gallery. On the day of the incident, the prosecutor said, addressing the jury, the defendant threw a pot of boiling oil at the victim during a dispute. These photos clearly show the extent of the injuries sustained. This was not an accident. This was an act of intentional violence. I stole a glance at my mother-in-law. Her expression had shifted slightly, her smugness replaced by a flicker of discomfort. Next came the witness statements. While most of the family had been reluctant to get involved, a few brave souls had come forward to testify. My cousin-in-law Julia took the stand, describing how she had witnessed my mother-in-law's toxic behavior at family gatherings. She has a way of making you feel small, Julia said, her voice steady. She uses intimidation and manipulation to get what she wants. I've seen her do it to others, and I've seen her do it to the victim. Then there was the financial evidence. The police had uncovered a string of questionable transactions linked to my mother-in-law, including funds taken from unsuspecting family members under false pretenses. While this wasn't directly tied to my case, it painted a damning picture of her character. When it was my turn to take the stand, I felt a lump rise in my throat. The room seemed to shrink as all eyes turned to me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I described the events of that day in detail, my voice steady despite the tremble in my hands. She wanted my house, I said, meeting the jury's gaze. She demanded that I hand it over to her friend, and when I refused, she became enraged. She threw the oil at me to punish me for standing up to her. The defense attorney tried to poke holes in my story, suggesting that I had provoked her or exaggerated the events. Isn't it possible, he asked, that this was simply an accident? That the oil spilled during an argument? No, I said firmly. She threw it at me. She aimed it at my face. When the defense rested, the courtroom fell silent. The judge gave the jury their instructions, and we were dismissed while they deliberated. The waiting was excruciating, every second stretching into an eternity. My lawyer reassured me that we had presented a strong case, but doubt gnawed at me. What if she got away with it? Hours later, we were called back into the courtroom. My mother-in-law was still wearing that smug expression, as though she was confident the jury would see her as the victim. But as the foreperson stood and read the verdict, her face crumpled. Guilty, the foreperson said, the word echoing in the silent room. The judge outlined her sentence. Community service, a fine, and mandatory restitution to cover my medical expenses. It wasn't a long sentence, but it was enough to send a message. As the judge concluded, my mother-in-law turned to glare at me, her eyes filled with venom. You'll regret this, she muttered under her breath as the bailiff escorted her out of the courtroom. I met her glare with a calm, unwavering gaze. Maybe, I said softly, but at least I'm free. Walking out of that courtroom felt like shedding 1,000 pounds of weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again. My husband, who had been conspicuously absent during most of the trial, texted me later that evening. Congratulations, his message read, dripping with sarcasm. You got what you wanted. Hope you're happy. I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say to him. That night, as I sat alone in my quiet house, I let the emotions of the day wash over me. Relief, exhaustion, and a strange sense of peace settled in my chest. This wasn't the end of my journey. There were still divorce proceedings to finalize and the inevitable fallout with the family to navigate. But it was a major step forward. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had control over my own life. And I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me again. The divorce finalized 3 months after the trial, a moment that felt both surreal and liberating. When the final papers arrived in the mail, I stared at them for a long time, letting the reality sink in. It wasn't sadness I felt, at least not entirely. There was some grief, yes, for the life I'd thought I was building, but it was eclipsed by an overwhelming sense of freedom. The legal battle had been draining, but with each signature and stamped document, the ties that had bound me to my ex-husband and his toxic family unraveled. I was finally free to start over, unburdened by the weight of their dysfunction. One of the first things I did was sell the house. The place that had once symbolized stability and a new chapter in my life had become a constant reminder of the chaos and pain I'd endured. Walking through it for the last time, I felt a pang of nostalgia for what could have been, but it was quickly replaced by relief. Moving out was an emotional process, but also a cathartic one. Every box I packed felt like a step toward reclaiming my independence. I donated furniture and decor that carried too many memories and decided to take only the essentials, things that would fit into the vision of the new life I was creating for myself. The day I handed over the keys to the new owners, I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in years. I moved to a new city, far enough away that I wouldn't run into anyone from my old life, but close enough that I wasn't completely isolated. The idea of starting over was daunting, but it was also thrilling. I found a small, cozy apartment in a quiet neighborhood and threw myself into creating a space that felt truly mine. Every decision, from the paint color on the walls to the type of coffee mugs I bought, was deliberate. For the first time in years, I didn't have to consider anyone else's opinion. I could just be myself, without judgment or interference. Cutting off contact with my ex-husband and his family wasn't as hard as I'd imagined. He tried to reach out once, leaving a voicemail that sounded half-hearted at best. "I hope you're happy," he said, his tone dripping with bitterness. "You got what you wanted." I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say to him. As for my mother-in-law, I heard from mutual acquaintances that she was furious about the trial and my refusal to reconcile with her son. "She's been telling anyone who will listen that you ruined her life," Julia told me during one of our occasional phone calls. "Let her," I replied, shrugging. "She can say whatever she wants. It doesn't affect me anymore." And it didn't. The venomous words that used to cut me so deeply now felt like distant echoes, barely worth acknowledging. Building a new life wasn't without its challenges. There were nights when loneliness crept in, whispering doubts and making me question whether I'd done the right thing. But those moments were fleeting, overshadowed by the growing sense of pride and self-worth that came with reclaiming my independence. I made new friends, joined local community groups, and even picked up hobbies I'd abandoned during my marriage. Slowly but surely, I began to rediscover the person I'd been before, strong, confident, and unafraid to stand up for herself. One evening, as I sat on my apartment balcony, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I thought about that fateful lunch. The moment my mother-in-law had hurled the oil at me, she believed she was breaking me, putting me in my place once and for all. But instead, she'd set something in motion that even she couldn't control. That day didn't break me. It made me. Looking back, I'm proud of how far I've come. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when I wanted to give up, when the weight of everything felt too heavy to bear. But I pushed through. I stood up for myself when no one else would, and I fought for my right to live a life free from toxicity and abuse. I learned that strength doesn't always come from big, dramatic gestures. Sometimes it's found in the quiet moments, packing up your things, signing divorce papers, or sitting in a courtroom and refusing to be silenced. Every now and then, I hear snippets about my mother-in-law. She's still as bitter as ever, still spreading lies and trying to control the people around her. But her reach doesn't extend to me anymore. And my ex-husband? He's reportedly still defending her, still trapped in the web of her manipulation. A part of me pities him, but mostly I feel relieved that I'm no longer part of that mess. Now, as I sit here in my little apartment, surrounded by things that bring me joy, I feel a deep sense of peace. My life isn't perfect, but it's mine. And that, more than anything else, is worth celebrating. When I think about that lunch, the moment she thought she'd broken me, I can't help but smile. Because in the end, I showed her and myself just how strong I could be.